I'm just fascinated by this notion that is just everywhere now, the so-called woke notion that America is fundamentally a racist country. And yet what I see is all these supposedly repressed races trying desperately to become Americans.
Welcome to The American Optimist. I'm Joe Lonsdale. We're excited to have our friend and mentor, Prime Minister Stephen Harper, the 22nd Prime Minister of Canada. We're on number 23 right now, but you were Prime Minister for about a decade.
Almost a decade, February 2006 to November 2015. So,
awesome. Well, welcome to Texas. Thanks for joining us.
I'm always glad to be in Texas and be fully vaccinated and living in the land of the free.
Well, I wanted to start by talking a little bit about recoveries, because Canada was famous under your watch for having probably the best recovery from the recession in 2008. You guys did an amazing job with you and Finance Minister Flaherty worked with you on that at the time, and others. Right. What are some of the lessons we can learn right now as we're trying to recover from what's going on?
Well, look, I think it's important to say, and I can be very critical of governments in Canada, the U.S., anywhere else. I think it's important to understand, first of all, Joe, that this crisis really has been unique and very different and more complicated than the time before. This is a combination pandemic and economic crisis, the solutions for one often being contrary to the solutions for the other. Mm-hmm. But look, now that our populations are increasingly vaccinated, the focus should be on economic recovery. And I think it's actually pretty straightforward, but it's the opposite of what governments are doing. The solution is to run strong market-oriented economic policy and allow the private sector, which has been reasonably sustained through this, to recover. Instead, what has happened, I think it's a fascinating study, in 08-09, all of us who were in office did so-called economic stimulus. Mm-hmm. And your country and most countries did extraordinary monetary policy. My country didn't, for obvious reasons, because obviously the crisis was not as deep.
Yeah.
But after that, we'd done that, what we considered extraordinary policy, then it was how do we get back to kind of a normally functioning economy? This time you have this fascinating thing where the intervention has been, in global economic terms, it's actually been about 10 times the size.
10 times more government spending.
10 times more government spending.
Wow, than 12
of what
years
it was. Well, I'll give you statistics. In Canada, and we thought I had run a large deficit back in 2009. In Canada last year, the fiscal year just completed, the deficit of the federal government will be 30% higher than my entire last budget. If I had not raised a dime in revenue in 2015, my budget balance would have been substantially lower than it actually is. That's how much spending governments have done. Canada's a bit of an outlier, but U.S. is a bit of an outlier too. So the levels of spending and intervention
is this partially because the parties in charge are just bigger spenders as well, or is it more? Is it a good reaction to what's going on?
It's not a good reaction. It's been overkill. A lot of spending was necessary, but first of all, it's had a different purpose. Remember, the spending back in 08-09 was to, quote, stimulate the economy. We had a free fall of the financial system, economic activity was freezing or plummeting.
Yep.
This time, the purpose of the spending has been to sustain incomes without stimulating the economy.
So you want to help people?
So people could stop working and not work, and we've done that, as I say, at a scale that's far greater, because it's costs far more money to keep people not working and factories not opening, et cetera, on an ongoing basis.
I've seen there's 9.3 million open jobs right now that people aren't filling, which is a record in the U.S.
Exactly. And so you have this extraordinary level, and now you have this extraordinary mentality. I think it's extraordinary, where governments are saying, look, this extraordinary economic policy, macroeconomic policy, has saved us from a complete crash during the pandemic, so why can't we just do this forever?
This is the modern monetary theory.
Modern monetary theory, but it's even a revival of kind of the ultra Keynesianism of the 1970s.
Yeah, it seems like a stupid version of Keynesianism that's taken to an extreme, basically.
It is. All of this, look, this is not all new. I tell people, for those of us now who have the gray hair and remember, this is all the late 60s, 1970s over again, just at a pace that is incredibly faster and going to lead to bad consequences much more quickly.
What are some of the consequences if you screw this
up? The
up?
first and obvious one is inflation. And by the way, I just saw the consumer inflation here hit 5%, and that's with all kinds of changes to keep the number down.
Of course,
all kinds of statistical changes to try and keep the number down. But that's only consumer inflation. My own view is that we've had inflation for some time now. It's been asset inflation. It's bubbles in everything. And now you're getting consumer inflation. And what happens, Joe? I mean, it's to say we've been through this movie before. What happens is, at some point, this requires interest rate hikes.
Yep.
And as soon as you have interest rate hikes,
and the asset prices will crash.
You have impacts on investment, and you have, more importantly, all of a sudden, all this quote affordable government spending is not so affordable. So I think significant.
So we're kind of boxing. We're kind of boxing ourselves in because you have to raise rates, but you can't raise rates at some point, and then it gets to be a mess.
Yeah, this is this is bad macroeconomic policy on an enormous scale. Yeah.
Well, that's a challenge. I want to also ask about Canada and the outbreak, because a lot of people at the beginning of the pandemic, they lauded Canada to handle it better, but now it seems pretty clear that Canada is pretty far behind the U.S. in how it's handling all of this.
Look, I always said that. I always cautioned anyone who was saying that a certain country or a certain government had it right and others had it wrong. The truth is, in fairness, all governments were feeling their way. They didn't really know how to manage this. And I said, wait until this is all over and we see what the cumulative impact is in terms of both the virus on the one hand and the economy on the other. And that still hasn't played out totally. I was just writing to some clients this week that, everybody, I would say everybody, a lot of people have lauded China's success to date in containing the virus and keeping its economy growing. But actually, you now have the Chinese population is now one of the least naturally immunized through infections in the world, and one of the least effectively vaccinated populations in the world. And actually now, the extraordinary level of social and economic control they've had to implement to contain the virus beyond what the Communist Party normally does, they now is now their only option going forward. Whereas in a country like this, where infection rates have actually been high, and vaccination rates are now reasonably high.
So we're done now. Basically.
Yeah, U.S. is increasingly done.
Whereas China might have another couple of years of this. Who knows?
In fact, U.S. is one of the few countries that's getting close to this being really over. So time will tell. So Canada, Canada contained the virus early on.
But now there's more pain later because we still have to.
Well, there's pain later because we were so slow in the vaccination effort.
Is that indicative of larger problems? Why were they so slow in vaccination?
Look, I tend not to comment too much on my successor government. I'll just say that, people in the opposition and people in the drug industry have explained why Canada was so slow in the vaccination. All I'll say is when we were in government, we never had any problem making sure we had vaccines well in advance and getting them distributed. So it's just a matter of competent execution.
Is it a matter also of working well with business, or is that?
Yeah, to some degree, in the drug industry, we'll say there's poor relations between the federal government and the drug industry have not helped. Yeah.
Well, let's focus on something optimistic about Canada. Under your leadership, there was tremendous growth in small businesses, in innovation centers. You guys did a lot with Vancouver. Waterloo became these kind of roaring powerhouses, right? I've hired hundreds of people out of those schools, and actually we started building businesses there as well in Canada. What does Canada need to do to continue this and to continue becoming strong in innovation?
So look, we'll get a second into the kind of micro things we did, but I think the macro things are really important. Just creating a good environment for business with low and stable tax rates, and and a culture that encourages business and views profit as a good thing under normal circumstances. That all helps. A special advantage we had in Canada through all that period was our immigration policies, especially our far easier ability in the United States to bring in skilled technical people. And that's, I think, still a bit of an advantage for Canada. But that was an advantage to them and did encourage some business to come to Canada. We'd also taken another number of measures as a government in the venture capital space to try and encourage that ecosystem, which was very weak in Canada when we took office. So, look, these are the things you need to continue. I'd also say that Canada, even in some of our bigger schools, even some of our more successful schools in terms of IT people, there's a lot more we could be doing. We could be trying to scale up those programs a lot more.
They could be a lot bigger, a lot more.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense. And in discussing business, we talk a lot about some of the issues with China. And, during this crisis, obviously, there's a lot of problems with supply chains. Who knows what you can get from China and India. On my side,
or what you're getting.
Yeah, or what you're getting. On my side, we've spent over $1 billion at 8VC building biomanufacturing in the U.S., in Canada recently, just because we're worried about where we can get things from. Otherwise, it's a valuable expertise to have here. I guess more bluntly, is globalization over? Are we still going to be working with the whole rest of the world? How do we think about these challenges?
Well, I don't think globalization is over. Joe, I wrote a book on this right here, right now, and the book was essentially talking about the problems of globalization and some aspects of post-Cold War market policy and how we had to adjust them. And I wasn't suggesting it was over. I was just suggesting it had to be a lot smarter. For example, and this is the obvious one when we're talking about medical supply chains, surely it always made sense, even in the era of globalization and even in the coming era, to make sure that critical security-oriented supply chains are not in the hands of countries that are not necessarily friendly to your national security.
Yes.
This is...
Well, they are, because Taiwan produces so much that we use for some of these things.
Well, Taiwan, yes, but obviously
which is not China, but then if...
Not mainland China. But we saw this in a whole range of things. For instance, Canada, United States, depending on Russia to launch satellites. Who thought of this kind of stuff? Yeah. All the kind of... At the end of the Cold War, kind of all common sense on economic interaction related to national security just went out the window. And we just assumed everybody either is a friend or is going to be a friend in short order. So we can trust them with anything. And obviously, so that has to change. But I think going forward, there are two things that have to be done. As I say, one, there has to be a realistic assessment about, who are countries who are not friendly or dependable on security matters, and in those areas making sure not just that your supply chains are not dependent on those, but make sure there is redundancy in terms of sources of supply. I don't think it's just a matter of bringing it onshore.
Sometimes you have multiple other countries you can work with.
Yeah, or I don't think it's necessary in the government's interest to create, even within the country, a monopoly supply chain. You still want redundancy and you still want options. But let's make sure those options are certainly not, as a minimum, exclusively in countries that are not dependable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that makes sense. Is Taiwan something you're at all worried about the next 10 or 20 years?
Yeah,
if we keep something in Taiwan that's critical, should we also have a backup because China could so easily blockade Taiwan, or how do we think about this?
When I say I'm worried about Taiwan, be clear, I'm not worried about the Taiwanese.
No, of course, you're worried about China doing something.
Yeah, I'm worried about, I think there's growing worries in national security circles that in a much sooner time frame than people once thought, that China may try to actually forcefully take Taiwan.
My view on this is that Sun Tzu said, "Never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake," and I feel like China would be interrupting North American regimes that are quite broken right now, and therefore it would actually make the regimes look quite bad in North America, and so therefore they're going to wait to do this. What do you think of that?
I'm not betting on it happening in the next 2 years, but whereas 10 years ago I would have said the chances of that happening were zero, I no longer think that's the case. But, it wasn't very long ago I would have told you that it was not in the interests of the People's Republic of China to completely end Hong Kong's autonomy and the unique nature of the Hong Kong system. Yeah. And so, and by the way, that wasn't quite the same thing as a seizure because it technically was part of China, but under international treaty and law, China had an obligation to treat Hong Kong as an autonomous region with a completely different system of government, and they flagrantly violated that commitment.
If you were in charge when they had done that, would there have been more repercussions?
I would have hoped there'd be more repercussions. Look, I have to qualify that, Joe, because as Prime Minister of Canada, I couldn't have led repercussions.
You would have had to work with your allies.
But certainly I would have urged our allies to respond more forcefully to that. I think one of the responses that could have been considered was, if you do not restore your obligations or stop the transformation of Hong Kong, then we will recognize Taiwan as a separate entity.
And you were part of the G7 for over a decade.
Right.
What should the G7 be doing with regard to this, with regard to make China behave better? Like, how could they work together to actually give us an optimistic solution?
Well, that's the key, is to work together. The key is to work together. We have to, we're discussing this, as you know, I chair a group called the IDU. You spoke at the Global Federation of Conservative Parties, and we're discussing, what kind of common approaches could we take to China to incent better behavior and to better protect our own interests. I think we all believe that, unlike the Soviet Union of the Cold War, China is not everything about China is bad, and there are opportunities in China. So how can we kind of exploit the better side of the Chinese system while minimizing the risks of the negative side? But look, it requires a common approach. Let me give a practical example of that. When the Chinese decide to punish Australia, cut its exports, put on tariffs, etc. Yeah. When they ask reasonable questions about the virus. What we should be doing as other Western countries is having a shared rebuttal to that, not us all trying to figure out how we get Australia exports taken to us instead.
Got it.
Because
that
divide and conquer behavior is a really serious long-term problem.
It seems like a really messy, silly way to run things, that we're just each trying to take advantage instead of working together against them.
Yeah, so it does. Look, prior to, but let's be clear about the environment. Prior to President Trump, there was not an agreed posture in any Western country that China was actually a long-term threat. Now, it happened to be my view, but I can tell you it was not really shared by very many people.
So your view only became more common after Trump was...
Yeah, well, Trump transformed that view in both parties in the United States, but Trump transformed the view, but he did not actually have a strategy, certainly not one involving allies.
He wasn't able to work with others to get anything done.
So now, the opportunity is to take, I think Trump's more accurate read of the challenges of the situation and turn it into a common proactive strategy. But, that does require some toughness. By the way, I see evidence the Biden administration is trying to develop a strategy and working with allies. But the real question around the present administration is, when pushed, will it have backbone?
Will it show courage? Yeah. I want to talk a little bit more about America in general. We started the show because there's a wave of pessimism swooping across America lately. Many of us believe that our best days are behind us. Some people don't even believe America was great to begin with. They're very skeptical of a lot of the values. What are the ideas and principles behind America's founding mean to you? Obviously, you didn't run America, you ran Canada, but what do they mean to you, and what do they mean to the world? Are these principles important for the world?
Well, first of all, when I think about, as a Prime Minister of Canada, I don't think of them in terms of America's principle. I think of them kind of as the common Western and particularly Anglo-American heritage that Canada is a part of.
Yep.
But first of all, let's be clear what the problem is. There are those who have an assessment that, as you say, better days are behind us, that the future is not as optimistic. And that's an assessment that one can reasonably or not reasonably have. But you said another one, that America never was very good to begin with. Yeah. That's the real problem, Joe. The real problem in the West, and let me talk about the West more than America, although, this is the flagship country. The real problem in the West is not that our prospects are not good. It's elements in our own countries and our own societies that do not want us to succeed. Yeah. They do not want us to succeed.
They want to tear down the current system.
They want to tear down. The modern left, called Marxist often, is not really socialist. It's nihilist. Its ethics are entirely nihilist. And it's all about ripping everything down. I could go into, all the reasons why I think this is so. It doesn't really matter what the explanation for it is. It's all bad, and it needs to be fought and opposed. Yep. And the desire we all have to make constant change in our and progress in our societies should not have as its assumption that everything is wrong and terrible and awful. Quite the contrary. It's that our societies are sufficiently good at their core that this kind of progress is always possible. Yep. And, look, Canada, the United States, obviously speaks specifically in my own country, and I can see lots of things wrong with my own country, and you can see lots wrong with yours. But yet, I can tell you travel around the world, and there's no other time in history and no other place you'd rather be. I'd say the great contradiction, as you know, I watch American politics, almost in great quantities. The reason I do is I kind of ignore the politics of my own country because I'm too emotional about it. So I can be an analyst on U.S. affairs, and so I watch American politics all the time, and I'm just fascinated by this notion that is just everywhere now, the so-called woke notion that America is fundamentally a racist country. And yet what I see is all these supposedly repressed races trying desperately to become Americans and to join the United States. So, it's not that there aren't problems, historical and present, that are real, but the core of our countries are great, and they have great futures, and there is no alternative. The adolescent egos of the woke university crowd is not an alternative governing philosophy for any society. And
where's this illiberalism coming from? That this is complicated. You call it nihilist, but there's this. It's new on the left to have this illiberalism, right? And that's something that we didn't really have that as much, or did we always have this massive?
Well,
illiberalism?
it's always been on the extreme left.
But it's kind of, so it's leaked into the rest of society.
What the far left and the far right always have in common?
They're both illiberal.
Yeah, they're both illiberal.
But more of the left seems to have taken.
But if you look, go right back to Marx and Engels, of which I'm actually very knowledgeable. I mean, it was always illiberal.
Yeah.
It was always illiberal. And anyone who says that, Marxism was distorted into totalitarianism by the Soviets or the Chinese, whoever, is missing the whole. You read original Marxism, the totalitarianism is at its root. Marx's view was that. And you hear the same terms thrown around today, that his opinions were not opinions, they were science. And anyone who disagreed with his thoughts on what is happening today or what will happen in the future is not merely wrong on the issue, he is going against the fundamental science of humanity.
Really, so Marx would say you're going against science, and you disagree with me a lot.
And therefore, because you're simply arguing against facts, then you get to the kind of Soviet mentality that all dissent is essentially a mental illness or something that needs to be re-educated and corrected,
or banned from social media.
And
no doubt.
And this has been that crowd's philosophy, going back, by the way, before Marx to Rousseau and others. And it's become now, since the 60s, very large in university movements and university campuses.
Are we at a cultural tipping point? This is spread everywhere. Is this going to continue? Are we reaching a peak? Like, how's this going to play out?
I hope it doesn't. If it plays out, our societies fail.
So we have to fight it.
Our societies fail. Yeah.
So how do we fight it?
Look, I believe that in terms of there is a I think. It's not maybe as stark as it was in the Cold War, but there is a competition of systems right now. There's no doubt about it. A more not a certain, by no means a truly free market kind of American model, but a market-oriented American model, essentially, in spite of all of its non-market aspects, essentially driven by private enterprise and private innovation. And there's a Chinese model, which is all about state control and using markets as a tool of state control for economic and political power.
Totalitarian society that lets markets work and uses them.
I'm not sure I'd call it totalitarianism, but certainly an authoritarian. It's an authoritarian capitalist model.
Yep.
And
you think that's what would come here if this liberalism won?
Well, I think that is the main challenge. That is the main challenge.
That's the main challenge from China.
That's the main challenge of the United States. And look, what I argue that democracies, I hope, I believe, and I kind of believe. I must admit I'm getting a bit more pessimistic. I kind of believe and hope will triumph. I always tell people this is because democratic societies, democratic capitalist societies, and I think the two are inseparable, by the way, the reason we succeed over time is not because we ever quite get it right. In fact, our societies are too complicated and pluralistic to ever get it exactly right. Mm-hmm. It's that when we make mistakes, they tend to correct over time. Eventually the worst problems
there's self-correcting mechanisms where authoritarian societies don't have as many self-correcting mechanisms.
No, they have the opposite.
The governments double down on mistakes.
Tyrants, authoritarians must double down because the claim to an authoritarian's claim to power is that he is specially gifted and always right. As soon as an authoritarian says, "Oh, that was a real screw up," that's kind of the end of then somebody else says, "Well, I'm the guy who will never screw up, not you." So, like Mao Zedong is the extreme example of that. Just every decade,
just kept doubling
bigger
down
mistakes
on
than the
bigger
decade
things.
before. And Deng ultimately corrected that as within the context of that system with collective leadership and the experiment with markets, et cetera.
I was told by my mentors that Lee Kuan Yew was a huge influence on
Lee
him to
Lee
go in
Kuan
that direction
Yew
a little bit.
Lee Kuan Yew is example. Lee Kuan Yew is kind of, because he's a bit of a mixed model.
He is, yeah.
But Lee Kuan, obviously in a very different environment. Lee Kuan Yew's Lee Kuan Yew is a rare exception. Because, as I say, almost all dictatorships for life almost always end in tyranny and stagnation, neither of which happened with Lee Kuan Yew.
Lee Kuan Yew ran Singapore for 55 years or so.
Neither of which happened. Singapore continued its dynamic growth all through his time in office. And it's certainly a quasi-authoritarian state, but it didn't get worse on that regard. In fact, it actually got somewhat better.
I think it seems like the lesson from the last several decades is that you have to be authoritarian to get past maybe 10 or 12 years in office. That seems to be the rule.
Maybe. Look, I guess what I was saying, so this is why I think democracies will prevail, but let's be under no illusion. We will still only prevail in the end if we make better decisions than they do. And right now, I don't think it's, whether it's economics or the virus or anything, I don't think you have to be a really deep political analyst to say that, generally speaking, the Chinas have been making better decisions in the last couple of years than democracies.
Yep. Well, hopefully things will self-correct, and maybe there's natural limits to the authoritarianism.
But remember, that what's so threatening about what I say is the kind of far woke left is that it's trying to end the democratic system. I mean, it's not just trying to, pass big deficits in modern monetary theory and new education systems. It's trying to snuff out any opposition to those things. Its goal is authoritarianism.
Yeah, so you stop freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, freedom of property.
But that will not succeed, because that authoritarianism is so obviously inferior and incompetent to the Chinese version that it cannot possibly prevail.
That incompetence won't prevail. I tend to think that China is not going to allow enough creative destruction that will be required by the innovation coming in the next 10 or 20 years, and that maybe is an optimistic thing that we'll hopefully be able to be better to deal with in North America.
Yeah, I think there's every reason to believe, especially, I come to this country. Look, the dynamism of this country, the entrepreneurial dynamism in this country is just impossible to ignore. No matter how heavy-handed the role of government becomes or large it becomes, this is just such an entrepreneurial culture and so freedom-oriented in terms of personal behavior. By the way, I happen to think that this largely explains the rise of China. The rise of China is not explained by, that they came up with a genius political system. It's that Deng Xiaoping did sufficient reform to unleash the naturally entrepreneurial nature of the Chinese nation. Chinese nation, after Americans, is the most entrepreneurial culture in the world.
Yeah.
And he managed to unleash.
They're free enough to be entrepreneurial again.
Incredible. They've accomplished incredible things.
And they're able to work with our systems very well as well, of course.
Yeah, they've accomplished incredible things under what's still a highly restrictive system. So, but look, it's hard for me. America has to go a lot farther than it's gone to suppress that side of its culture.
So that's a big challenge, is where America is going to go. What lessons can we learn? So you led two minority governments and majority government in 2011. And you obviously were working in a somewhat polarized era as well. It's probably even more polarized today. But what are the lessons we could take from that to work in this environment?
Well, first of all, in fairness, Canada's political culture then and now is far less polarized than in the United States. And the underlying polarization of your political culture, in my view, is a serious problem. I don't really, how changing cultures. This as an entrepreneur. Changing cultures is a lot harder than changing policies, and especially when you're talking about mass cultures historically rooted. Polarization of U.S. society has been, in my observation, growing for at least 30 years.
Well, when culture goes wrong with our institutions, we create new ones in the tech world. And it's harder to do that. Although, could we be creating new institutions within the U.S. to help with that are functional versus some of the things we have now?
Look, I don't know. I'd just say, go back to my Canadian example. I had a less polarized culture. The other thing I had was our system of government. Our system of government, I told Barack Obama our first conversation when he was president and I was prime minister, and we were talking about challenges and opportunities in front of us, I told him he then had a majority in both houses of Congress and a supermajority in the Senate. I told him he had less ability to get things done under those circumstances than I did with a minority in both houses. In fact,
Wow.
I was not only a minority in the lower house, I was not even the largest party in the upper house. And I still had more ability to get things done. Why is that? It's because in the parliamentary system, you not only have the concentration of authority in the lower house, but it's a double-edged sword. The government either gets to govern or there's an election, which means your opponents cannot adopt the strategy of defeating you regardless of the consequences. They have to consider the consequences for themselves whenever they vote things down. So I had the option of a combination of tools that a president does not have.
That makes us more polarized here.
Yeah, I had people.
Interesting.
I had obviously ways of getting people to vote for me. I had ways of getting deal, but I also had ways of making other people support me whether they wanted to or not. And the president does not have.
And you
that
use
option.
that to rein in a lot of government spending and be very responsible. Is that something we could do here too, though, or just with the polarization it's too hard? Do you think?
Yeah, I think on the kind of the mismanagement, especially the mismanagement of your fiscal policy, and I really, I know, quote, America's a reserve currency, but I will assure you that not only can great powers go bankrupt, they have in history, and it's often a reason they cease to be great powers. You look at France in the 18th century, that's essentially what happened. This is not strictly a problem of a presidency or a political party. Both political parties in the United States at the national level have been on a trajectory to simply not care about the overall fiscal policy for some time.
Yep.
The only priority, if I'm be blunt here, the only priority of the Democratic Party has been to maximize government spending, regardless of how it is financed.
Yep.
And the only policy of the Republican Party has been to minimize taxation, regardless of levels of spending.
Yeah.
And so the agreement has been we'll spend as much as possible and tax as little as
You'll
possible.
compromise, tax nothing, and spend a lot more.
Nobody cares about the deficit because we can apparently borrow without limit.
Do you want a lot of dollars yourself, or would you not try to hold too many of those for the next 5 years?
I'm increasingly. I operate a U.S. dollar business because it's a global business.
Yeah.
But in my personal accounts, I still hold U.S. dollars because the options aren't great, but I do increasingly hold precious metals as well.
You want to diversify as well.
Yeah, I know. I'm very concerned about the U.S. cannot. I don't know how long it goes on, Joe. I'm just telling you that the people believe the United States can continue to borrow countless trillions of dollars at 0%. Not only do I believe that's not true, I believe that's actually coming to an end much quicker than people think.
And what turns this around, though?
I say inflation, and
at some point inflation it'll be painful, but hopefully we'll learn the lesson.
Inflation, interest rates begin to rise, interest rates on U.S. securities begin to rise. Now, what I think the worry is, and I hope will be avoided in the United States, may not be avoided in other countries, is once those rates rise. This is what happened in 08-09 in certain European countries, is once those rates rise and there's a huge debt stock, sometimes then markets panic and rates just go astronomical and suddenly you're in a debt crisis.
Yep.
I don't think the U.S. will hit that wall that quickly, but I think other countries could.
And hopefully we'll learn from it. I want to ask you one more question,
Sure.
about the Middle East. And you helped lead the coalition to destroy ISIS. You've been a big supporter of Israel. You talk a lot. Obviously, you condemn the recent attacks by Hamas in Israel, and you don't like the moral equivalence of people saying
I'm
they're
actually
the same thing.
chairman of kind of honorary chairman of an organization called the Friends of Israel Initiative, which unites as about 36 of us former high office holders, non-Jewish, who work to defend and promote Israel at the international level.
And you seem like optimistic about the Abraham Accords and what was accomplished with UAE and Israel.
It's the best story of 2020. As we were all locked in our basements, I guess the other good story of 2020 was how good video conferencing really had become. Because can you imagine? Like, I can tell you, 10 years ago, doing a video conference as prime minister was like pulling teeth.
My father-in-law's firm was invested in Zoom early on, so they had a good year with that.
Yeah, say thank God that happened just in time, because otherwise our economies really would have shut down. But so that was one good story. But the real good geopolitical story of 2020 was not just the Sunni Arabs and the Israelis coming and with obviously with the West, with President Trump, the United States, coming together in a peace pact, but I think the real fantastic story was framing it as the reconciliation of religions, taking that stick away from the jihadists and away from much more malevolent actors.
Yep.
Casting the common heritage of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as a uniting factor. And just at a time when, I think one of the biggest threats we face in the world, besides, the different Chinese model, a much more malevolent threat is the theocratic nuclear weapons-seeking regime in Iran. And the very fact that there could be an alliance, not just built around kind of an alliance of convenience, enemy of my enemy, but also around common principles and purpose. I think that was a tremendous story.
When you were prime minister, were you allowed to fly from Israel to the UAE, or did you also have to stop somewhere else? I always had to stop somewhere else. It's a new thing now. You're allowed to go between them.
Last year, last fall, I did a little bit of international travel last year as best I could.
Don't tell Trudeau. He doesn't like that.
No, well, this was before there was kind of the outrage about it. No, I did a business trip to I've done business in the United Arab Emirates, and I've done business in Israel. And for the first time in my life, I was able to fly to both countries at the same time on the same passport. Because before
you'd use different ones.
Before you had to make sure that some didn't see which sticker had what on it.
I always had the backups.
Yeah, so it's great, and it's fully embraced. Like
it really is. My friends in the UAE are just so bullish on Israel right now from the top. It's really cool, and I do business in both places too, so I'm excited to see it.
It's very exciting.
Well, that's not optimistic. No, thank you for your support of Israel over the years as a Jew and someone who's
well.
Very important
I don't
to me.
think. Look, I tell people it's not just a matter of a Jew. Being a Jew, I'm not a Jew. I supported Israel because Israel's long-term interests and threats parallel the interests and threats faced by American and Canadian society.
So as an American with Western values, it should be important to us as well.
If we are not prepared to stand on the front lines with Israel against those fundamental threats to free and democratic societies, then we are jeopardizing our own long-term interests. It was a view that I was very clear on in office and to all of our allies. And by the way, I thought this latest conflict, even though you had the normal, liberal media trying to, urge Israel to surrender when it's winning, the normal line. Of
course.
The fact was that there was far more overt support from Western governments for Israel this time than we'd seen in the past. I think of my friend Sebastian Kurz in Austria actually flying the Israeli flag in support of Israel during the conflict with Hamas.
You think it's easier to do that with the Abrahamic Accords already having happened?
I think that helps. I also think as Europe has not been as friendly to Israel as the United States or Canada, but I think there's increasing, with the rise of jihadism in Europe, there is increasing understanding that Israel faces threats that are not it is not only not Israel's faults. Those threats can easily come to their own shores.
Well, that makes sense. Well, it's like some of the accomplishments are at least a bright spot in the last year.
Yeah, it was a very bright spot, and I say we've got through the pandemic, and let's just hope that we come around on economics. Joe, the way I describe what's happening right now is what a lot of, whether it's, kind of these hyper Keynesian or bastardized Keynesian fiscal policy guys or the modern monetary theorists, they're trying to convince the population that the fundamental principle of economic science is untrue. The fundamental principle of economic science is that human desires and wants always outnumber available resources, and you have to make choices. They're trying to convince everybody you don't have to make choices. You can have wealth, go to work or not work whenever you feel like it, and there will be no implications on your taxation or your standard of living or your interest rate or inflation or anything else. You can just have whatever you want all the time, and production doesn't matter. And that's false. And so, as I say, hopefully, we'll be taught a lesson very quickly.
Over time, we'll learn. The good ideas will win. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Mr.
Thanks for
Prime Minister.
having me, John.